Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Olivia White of the McKinsey Global Institute.
Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. The past 25 years were really quite a miracle at the global level for productivity. And what did that mean? Part of it meant that lots of people from across the world moved from being urban dwellers and often smallholder farmers, eking out a living, to cities, and took up often low-skilled jobs, but jobs that paid more and were more productive. Think construction, think trade. At the same time, manufacturing in many countries developed. It became more sophisticated. It became more globally connected. And in terms of the numbers, what this translated to was, in 1997, the median country in the world had a labor productivity on an annual basis. The average employee across a year produced $7,000 worth of output. Fast forward 25 years, and in 2022, that number had jumped nearly sixfold to $41,000. What about in Latin America? Well, in 1997, Latin America as a whole had a productivity of $37,000 per year per employee, well above that $7,000 average at the global level. Fast forward 25 years, $43,000 a year. Now, why does this matter? First, there's some macroeconomic reasons. So, particularly in Latin America, in some form, despite the slow growth in productivity, the continent and the region has benefited from a population bonus. The number of workers has been going up. And that's meant that, at least in many places, output, GDP, has managed to grow simply because there are more workers, each of whom has the same productivity. Now, if we look forward, well, all of a sudden, productivity matters even more for reasons like the energy transition. That's going to cost money. How does one fund it? Reconfigurations in the world and supply chains amid geopolitical tension. It also matters at the human level. As you think about the consequences of people's making more money, generating more output, there are a lot of people in the world, and in Latin America, the number is roughly 50 to 60%, who live below what we at McKinsey Global Institute are calling an empowerment line. And that's not a line of poverty, it's a line of how much you need to be able to produce and earn in order to earn a decent living and have enough excess to make choices and be empowered in your life and in your children's lives. This is why it matters within a global context and within a human context. And so, if we look within that global context, where actually does Latin America sit? So this is productivity growth, an average compound annual growth over a 25-year period. You see China at the top, almost 8%. You see Western Europe at the bottom, about 0.6%, and Latin America just above Western Europe, sort of at the lowest advanced economy level. And these small differences, or maybe not so small differences in growth rate, of course, amplify over time. And as you think about this, note I'm talking about 25-year periods, and I'm doing that intentionally, because of course there are variations year to year, but what matters really is progression over longer periods of time. And so here's what that movie looked like over the past 25 years. So in 1997, you'll see Latin America highlighted. On the x-axis, productivity level. Productivity, roughly $37,000 per person, okay, per year, per worker per year. Similar to the levels of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, both of which were growing at that stage productivity faster, and well ahead of sub-Saharan Africa, of emerging Asia, of China, of India. Over the next 10 years, you'll see that productivity in Latin America started to grow, moving upwards on that y-axis. but from a very low and in fact slightly negative level. In other countries in the world, it also grew, and in many started to move forward to the right. But at this point, still, Latin America looks promising. Productivity is growing, and it's still at roughly the level of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But following 2007, and in the wake of the global financial crisis, productivity growth in Latin America fell again to zero, not having advanced productivity levels very much at all. In contrast to what happened in other emerging regions of the world which caught up. So, today, productivity in Latin America is roughly that of China. It's now fallen behind Eastern Europe, it's fallen behind Central Europe, and even emerging Asia and India have caught up. Why? So persistently low investment growth is a really important and sort of driving cause of all of this. You'll see in that top line, the growth of capital per hour in China grew over fourfold, 400% in the time from 1997 to 2000. India, downwards, and then Latin America, very, very little. And at this point, if you look at capital per worker, what people will call capital deepening, Latin America and China have just about the same level of capital depth today. Contrast what happened in Latin America, where this number has advanced very, very little, to those green lines, and these are the countries where it's advanced at least 50%, like China, like emerging Asia, like India. I'll zoom in, though, and this now coming down to a larger scale. You'll see that what happened in different Latin American countries actually is different. And there are some countries where, again, capital stock has advanced at least that 50%. So Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, Chile. Still, not terribly sort of as far advanced as one might have hoped, but there's some real variation across the region. What's happening within the structure of economies to start to understand some of this? Well, Latin America is and has been for the past 25 years dependent on commodities. Roughly 50% of its exports globally are commodities. And that's very significantly more than what one sees in other regions across the world. How about manufacturing? That's roughly the other 50%. Well, manufacturing growth is lagging, and there are two reasons, and I'll explain them in this chart. One is that employment share in manufacturing, at least as a fraction of the population, how many people are working in manufacturing, is declining. And you'll see on the left-hand side of this chart, in the red, these are all countries where the share of workers in manufacturing has gone down. On the right-hand side, places like Vietnam, as a share, more and more people are actually working in manufacturing. Now, that might be okay if, as in China on the top, you're actually growing productivity of manufacturing, even if you have fewer people as a fraction working in it. Not so in Latin America. What's happened is there are fewer people working in manufacturing, but there's actually not high productivity growth in manufacturing itself. And so the circles, the size of actual manufacturing output, are quite small compared to the size of the manufacturing output in, say, China or Vietnam or even Poland, India, Turkey, where the circles, the size of that output, are much bigger. What about services? And also, what about the overall knowledge that goes into manufacturing and enables economies to get more complex? Well, Latin America itself is an importer of knowledge, not generally a creator of it. And you'll see on the left-hand side of this chart, exports of intellectual property flowing across the world. So for example, North America is responsible for roughly 44% of intellectual property exports across the world. Look down, Latin America, 1%. Right-hand side, how much different countries import. So, for example, North America, 24%, so they're a net exporter. Latin America, 8%. They're very much a net importer. And I say this not because it's some form of admonition for Latin America to be a greater producer of intellectual property, though one might wonder if that makes sense in certain areas. But to say, look, to the degree that this is the case, how do you harness and act deliberately around it? In a world in which perhaps there's a decrease in commodity dependence and a complexity, increase in complexity of services and of manufacturing. So for all of this, is it time for a rethink, and what would that consist in? Well, what infrastructure is needed? what infrastructure is needed, particularly in cities, but also to help Latin America as a greater producer and then transporter of the things that it produces. What's needed for economy diversification? I haven't talked about it explicitly, but strong institutions, from institutional strength and regulatory stability down to education and skills, underpin this all. And returning to the point that I emphasize most, as I've been talking, investment is absolutely critical as a key to unlocking productivity growth. So as a question and as a thought, I will leave you all with this question of what would it take to double investment in Latin America? Thank you.